soon as I'm convinced the area is clear, I will pull the power to idle now. I'll say I'm beginning my emergency descent. I'm going to pitch for 120 knots, letting that nose fall in a 45-degree bank.
Hey guys, welcome back. Sam Terrell, the Northwest Aeronaut, and today we're talking about some emergency situations that I often see a lot of confusion on when I'm doing either mock check rides or flying with other people's students. And that is specific to the engine fire and emergency descents. So today we're going to be spending most of the time in the airplane where I'm going to be going over both these scenarios. But the point that I want to really make during this video and that I want you guys taking away from this is that, number one, an emergency descent is a maneuver just like any other maneuver. It's got its own page in the ACS, and yes, you are expected to demonstrate it on your private pilot check ride and commercial pilot check rides. An emergency descent can be done in either the clean configuration or the dirty configuration, so you want to make sure you're practiced in both configurations, so if the DP asks you to do it any certain way, you're comfortable doing so. Number two, an engine fire is separate from an emergency descent. In the ACS, it's on a separate page, and it has nothing directly to do with that maneuver other than an engine fire could be a reason why you would choose to do an emergency descent. So it's a popular emergency for DPs to present to you in a check ride in order to kind of coax an emergency descent out of you. It's to see if you can connect those dots and say, well, I'm on fire. This would be a perfect opportunity to do an emergency descent. But it may not be the scenario that your DP gives you. Different DPs have different approaches to it. Sometimes they just say, hey, we need to lose some altitude. Why don't you show me an emergency descent? Or it could be any number of other scenarios depending on what type of plane you're in. If you're in a pressurized aircraft, you can probably count on them giving you the scenario of a rapid decompression and having to do an emergency descent from altitude. But whatever scenario they give you, the maneuver doesn't change. So in the case of an engine fire, the mistake I see is that folks will sometimes even completely neglect the engine fire tasks and just jump straight into diving at the ground without looking or clearing the area or anything. What we always have to remember is that in a check ride, we don't have any real emergencies, hopefully. We have simulated emergencies. So we need to take our time. We need to make sure we're doing everything we do before any other maneuver. We need to clear the area, make sure our airplane is configured, and then begin the maneuver. But when it comes to the engine fire by itself, all you're expected to do is your engine fire checklist. This is typically things like turning the fuel off, pulling the mixture out, closing air vents and cabin air, turning off the master switch, anything that your POH advises in regards to the engine fire scenario. Again, once you have finished these tasks and taken your checklist out just to double check you didn't forget anything, the DP could say something like, well, it looks like your airplane's still flaming. It's still smoking. So then you could say, well, I'm going to do an emergency descent because I'm on fire. I need to gain some airspeed to put these flames out, and I want to get on the ground quickly. But first, I'm going to do some clearing turns. I'm going to make sure the area, specifically the area right below me, is clear. Then, once you've done that, made a radio call perhaps to anyone in the area, you can begin the maneuver of an emergency descent. That's all I'm going to say for now. Let's go ahead and jump into the airplane where we're going to talk about engine fires and emergency descents.
All right, guys, we're talking about engine fires today. Now, here's the misconception I see about engine fires from most private and even commercial candidates when they're getting ready for their check ride. I'll say, hey, it looks like your engine's on fire. And then they will immediately, sometimes they won't even address, they might turn the fuel off, they might pull the mixture. But after they do that, they're immediately just pulling the power and diving at the ground. That's a surefire way to fail a check ride, guys. We need to understand that during a check ride, we are just simulating. emergencies. They're not real emergencies, so we can take our time. It's more just a discussion topic between you and the DPE. What you also have to understand is that, for instance, an emergency descent and an engine fire fall under two separate sections of the ACS. They are not one thing. So when the DPE says, hey, I think your engine's on fire, the first and only thing you need to be worried about doing is simply running your engine fire checklist. Now, I use the GAS acronym. This is the same acronym I use for an engine failure, except that in an engine failure, we're looking to make sure these things are on. In an engine fire, we want to make sure they're off. So gas, G is for gas. Fuel, off. Mixture, out. A is air. We are closing the throttle. We are making sure the carburetor heats off. We are closing air vents and cabin air and heat. And then S, spark. We're turning the master switch off. That's what the checklist calls for. Now you should have that flow memorized. But once you've secured the airplane and done your flow, it's still good to double check your actual emergency checklist. Engine fire, mixture, idle cutoff. Fuel shutoff valve, off. Master switch, off. Cabin air and heat, off. Airspeed greater than 85 knots. Now this is where people kind of get confused and they just start diving at the ground. So what you got to understand is that examiners will often use an engine fire as a prompt to give you a reason to do an emergency descent. But once you've done all this checklist, it's not time to just dive at the ground. We still need to clear the area, especially right below us, and make sure we're not going to hit anybody. So we've done our engine fire checklist, we've secured the airplane. Now we can say, hey, I'm going to do an emergency descent, but first I'm going to clear the area. So I put myself into a nice left turn. I'm looking out the window. Actually, I'd probably do it in a right turn because I'm sitting on the right, but you'd be doing it to the left. I'm looking out the window, I'm looking below us, making sure there's not any airplanes, any air spaces, anything like that below us that I shouldn't be going into. We're just outside Hillsboro right now, and now I'll make a call. West practice area 65813, 2 miles south of Forest Grove, 6,500, emergency descent, west practice. Also, this is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, guys, but there's no such thing as a simulated emergency descent. If you are calling on the radio that you're doing a simulated emergency descent, just stop. There's no such thing as a simulated emergency descent. It's an emergency descent. It's a maneuver, okay? The emergency might be a simulation, but the emergency descent is not a simulation. It's a maneuver. All right, we're doing our emergency descent, and here, I don't even stop my clearing turn. As soon as I'm convinced the area is clear, I will pull the power to idle now. I'll say I'm beginning my emergency descent. I'm going to pitch for 120 knots, letting that nose fall in a 45-degree bank. 45-degree bank. This is how we get our engine fire to go out if it did not go out already by itself, just through securing the airplane, turning the fuel off, and all that. All right, we're coming down to 120. For the emergency descent, you have -10 plus 0. So if you're going to say I'm coming down at 120, you can be between 110 and 120, but no more than 120. All right, there's 119. We're coming down nicely. So from here, the examiners, they'll do a number of things. They might give you a certain altitude to stop the maneuver at, or they might simply say, hey, it looks like your fire stopped. What are you going to do now? The smoke stopped. Well, now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pitch for best glide. I don't need to keep losing altitude now, so I'm going to stop the emergency descent. I am going to pitch for best glide. I don't have an engine anymore, so guess what? Now I got to find my forced landing location. I'm looking at the ground. I see a nice big field over here. We would get over that field. We would circle down. We would finish securing the plane. If you felt comfortable turning your master back on so that you'd have radios, you might squawk 7700 and call for Mayday, but that's up to you. You have to kind of feel out the situation and see if that's something you feel comfortable doing, or if there's a chance it could start the fire again, you probably don't want to do it. So guys, that's your engine fire and your emergency descent. Key things to take away: the engine fire and the emergency descent are two separate topics in the ACS. They're not one thing. It's just that the engine fire is a reason that you could go into an emergency descent. And so the DP will often give that to you as a reason to begin the emergency descent maneuver.
All right, guys, welcome back. Hey, I hope that was helpful. Engine fires and emergency descents, two separate portions of the ACS on a check ride, but one can very well lead into the other. Whether that's the way your DP will approach it or not, it's completely up to your DBE. But just remember, address one thing at a time. Address the fire, then address the emergency descent as appropriate. I hope this was helpful. Please put any comments or questions you have down below in the comments. And until next time, resume your own navigation. See ya.